Hi, this is Lynn Olson. I'm a senior fellow at Future Ed, and I welcome you to this webinar. Enthusiasm for the science of reading has exploded, fueled by parents, civil rights leaders, advocacy groups, and the media, and in response to troublingly low scores on national reading tests and extensive learning loss during the pandemic. A Future Ed analysis has found that in the past 5 years, more than 30 states in every part of the country, with leaders from both political parties, have passed laws requiring instruction in the early grades that's based on the science of reading. These measures shape everything from how teachers and prospective teachers are trained, to the curriculum used in classrooms, to how students are assessed and whether they're retained in grade. The science of reading isn't a program. It's a substantial body of research that emphasizes the 5 critical components of early reading instruction: phonemic awareness, or being able to hear and manipulate the smallest units of sound and speech; phonics, or sounding out words by understanding the relationship between letters or groups of letters and sounds in speech; fluency, or being able to read accurately with appropriate speed and expression; oral language and vocabulary skills, including understanding academic vocabulary and reading comprehension. The challenge now is how to translate these new state policy initiatives into effective classroom practices, scaling instruction based on the science of reading in the nation's vast, decentralized system of public school districts. To help us tackle that issue, we're lucky to be joined by 3 expert practitioners today: Penny Schwinn, the former State Commissioner of Education in Tennessee and a Future Ed Senior Fellow; Kiffany Pride, Assistant Commissioner for Learning Services for the Arkansas Department of Education; and Mary Bussman, a leader in the Office of Educational Equity for the Roseville Area School District in Minnesota. As you have questions and listen to this, feel free to add them into the Q&A, and we'll try to answer them over the course of this webinar. Penny, I want to start with you. Why did you make early literacy instruction one of the pillars of your state blueprint when you became Commissioner of Education in Tennessee?
Absolutely. So appreciate the question. It's nice to be on with everyone today. Very excited about my co-panelists. So, in Tennessee, it's been a long and storied history. And I think that's one of the big lessons learned is continuity over time. And so certainly that was a passion of mine personally and professionally as an educator. But it had been over a decade before me of really strong reforms over 2 different governors, Bredesen and Governor Haslam, followed by Governor Lee. And so we've made strong progress over time. So I absolutely want to make sure that that's an important point in terms of you're not going to do it in one term or under one governor. You have to be able to keep moving. And so for Tennessee, we're at the point of time where we had flatlined. We had this huge rise under Race to the Top, and some of the standards change and reform that had occurred in the state. And then we had leveled off at around a third of our students proficient. And when you think about that, even our highest performing areas, a lot of our students, especially those that had traditionally been underserved, you're still at a flip of a coin over proficiency. And that's just not acceptable if you're a parent. And certainly we know our teachers deserved and wanted more in terms of their support. And so we also understood the data that I'm sure folks on this call are very familiar with, but just the graduation rates, 4 times more likely to graduate, your health outcomes, your income outcomes, your overall life expectancy, things that you would think are not related to literacy are absolutely related to that. And even in this future of technology and AI that we're talking about now, fundamentally, kids still need to be able to read. We cannot AI our way out of literacy as a core requirement for public education in this country. And so when you think about nationally that 2/3 of our students are not on grade level, that is much lower for students with disabilities, English learners, and students who traditionally come from low-income communities. There was a moral imperative as much as a philosophical imperative to be able to do something. And so in Tennessee, we were at about 32 to 35% proficiency, depending on the grade level. That actually declined over time in some grades, which was even more alarming. And we found that that was the single most important thing that we needed to do to create more equitable access and opportunity for all of our students. We felt that it was absolutely possible. It shouldn't be considered a reach goal. We should operate with the clarity that every child can and must be able to read on grade level in the earliest grades. And then we kind of marshaled from a policy perspective, certainly a funding perspective and an implementation perspective, the resources necessary to move forward pretty aggressively over a 4.5-year period.
And Penny, that's a really important point that you laid out both a multi-year plan and a quite comprehensive approach to literacy instruction. And would love you to talk about what the key elements were and why you took a comprehensive approach to how to address this in your state.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we looked at as a team, and I had the great fortune of representing a very strong and amazing team of folks who did this work. But on that team, what we realized is that oftentimes states and districts have a little bit of a whack-a-mole approach. They take one or two things at a time because that's what they feel like their capacity can hold, but then you miss all of these other interconnected opportunities. You don't have cohesion and you don't have alignment. And then people wonder, well, why didn't it work at that pace? Well, you address curriculum, but you didn't actually address teacher prep or professional development, or you have a great parent strategy, but it's completely misaligned from what's happening in the classroom. And so we called it Reading 360 because we really wanted to make sure we were addressing every single component of what we thought would most impact the child's ability to read on grade level. And that included everything from certainly high quality instructional materials so that it was phonics, but it's also knowledge building materials for students. We looked at professional development. So every teacher, not just in elementary school, but we actually expanded that up to the secondary grades, would have strong professional development opportunities to really understand the science of reading, significant ongoing coaching and support led by districts, not the state, but by districts, so that they owned the decision making and who their providers were, how often they met and where they focused. So there was a lot more local ownership. Ed prep reform, which we were able to do through policy, working closely with universities like the University of Tennessee, where they developed courses and content to be used amongst their peers. So again, there was ownership. We really factored in alignment. And then a lot of partnerships. So PBS developed resources and put them online. We had lots of parent engagement. We have a mascot named Riley the Raccoon who traveled to all the elementary schools. And then partners across the board who were able to then take the work, had access to the same levels of resource. All of it's open sourced on the website, which is Best for All Tennessee. So every training, every document, every video, anybody in the country can see. And we actually saw that at least one kind of group in all 50 states during the pandemic especially utilized those resources because it did tackle that full continuum. So if I'm a parent, I know what's happening in the classroom. I have decodables sent to my home. I have text apps that help me understand what I should be doing kind of week to week with my children. If I'm a teacher, I understand my role in this and feel like I have the support. But you really want to have that vertical and horizontal alignment. And then the last thing I would say is we talk about the three-legged stool, and it has to be all three. So it can't just be that you covered the 360 of what happens for a child. You have to have policy in place to make sure that the foundations are known across the board about what the expectations are. You have to fund it, and you have to fully fund it to make sure you can do it at the quality level. And you have to focus on exceptional implementation. Passing a policy is not the hardest part. The hardest part is making sure everyone who's impacted by that policy deeply understands and has what they need to execute effectively.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think one of the big questions once states have passed a law is sort of sequencing and what do you think about first and how do you ensure high quality implementation? And I know one of the big challenges initially is how to train the existing teacher workforce, given that many of them weren't trained in the science of reading as part of their initial teacher preparation. So Kiffany and then Penny, I'd love you to talk about how your state initially thought about this incredible scale problem of how to re-educate teachers around the science of reading.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So yeah, as you know, it can be a tremendous task to train teachers who are already in the classroom and those who are, aspiring teachers. So with our reading initiative for student excellence, one of the things we did is we had multiple pathways by which teachers could be trained. And to really think about that in scale, the first year during that initiative, we had some pilot groups, cohorts, I'll say. And fortunately, I was actually on the other side of this. I was in a district and I was one of the first sets of districts to be part of this. and shortly after joined the agency. So I have a view from both sides. And I'll say that that scale, that small scale, at the very beginning was very, very beneficial. And so doing it that way, we really made sure that we met the needs of teachers, leaders, and really thought about how do you take this for the long haul? So we started with those cohorts, and it just built over time. And with the legislation, we had so much time to get everybody trained. And it worked really well because we had those multiple pathways for teachers to be trained. And it worked well. And it was just not, you got training. It was a year-long, 3-year training. You had a coach who followed up with you through the classroom. And so I think that was very beneficial, and it helped build the level of training that was needed to actually implement at the classroom level for teachers who had not had the training in school and over time, and it was something new. So I think that was very beneficial, and it's paid off for us in the long run.
Penny, how did you think about that initial challenge of how to train teachers across the whole state?
So we had the great fortune, I think, of a real sense of urgency from our General Assembly and certainly in the department and from our districts. And so we had the mandate to train every teacher within 2 years. And so we, at this point, the state's trained over 45,000 teachers. And we did that in a couple of ways. So one was having some flexible and more modular approaches and kind of trying to balance time. And so we had a 1-week online approach we built with an outside vendor, and we co-built that work. And then the second was an in-person that was done at the school or at the district office so that it was much more personal and aligned to the needs of that particular region. And so that was in person. Teachers were also compensated for that time, even if it was during kind of a regular school day or kind of additional professional development hours. So there was a minimum of $1,000 that every teacher was compensated for participating in week 2. That really allowed for folks to be able to have access to the professional development and a schedule that was a lot more flexible for what different districts needed that were on different schedules. The second thing was that districts had the opportunity to utilize other partners they might have worked with. So as long as it met our minimum requirements, if they had already proactively gone through training, let's say they did letters or TNTP or really great reading or some kind of other program, they were able to appeal to the state and say, this is what we are doing that's aligned to our larger literacy plan. So that flexibility was important. And then I think the third thing was that it had to be able to be open to not just traditional elementary school educators, but we believe that anyone who had any role in literacy for a child needed to take this training. And that included our instructional leaders. Oftentimes physical education, science, math teachers wanted this kind of work because they had the same challenges with their own students, even if it wasn't an ELA classroom. And so that really expanded the number of folks that we had to support. And so using our ed prep providers was really important, especially as that connected to our statewide tutoring initiatives and some of our other COVID recovery projects. There was just a great demand. And so our ed prep providers really stepped in to be able to provide additional support and training for folks in their regions. And that also helped us to make sure that that content was really aligned. And so it's getting a great provider to do it with you because the state cannot do everything, nor should we be doing everything. It's making sure that you hold a very high, unwavering bar for rigor, content, and alignment. You cannot lower quality. And the thing that I'm most proud of is that 97 to 98% of our teachers rated their training as effective or highly effective, which is a unicorn because the best you usually ever get is 70 to 75%. But we were pretty unapologetic about sending work back if it did not meet a requirement that we felt our teachers were absolutely entitled to. And then the third thing to get that many teachers trained is you have to see it as a year-long project. It can't be something that you just do in the summer. You have to give districts the flexibility to fit it into something that they are already doing. They have their own strategic plan. The state is just one other thing. And so working closely with districts was critical for us.
And Mary, I know that your district selected letters training. Could you tell me a little bit about how you thought about training your teachers, why letters, and what was the reaction of teachers once you actually did this training?
Sure. And again, thank you. It's wonderful learning from the other panelists, and thanks for having me here as well. In Roseville, we go through a curriculum review process. Once every 10 years as state legislatures update the standards, right? And so our curriculum review process for K-6 language arts started in the fall of 2020. And that team really did a lot of pre-reading around what was the current research, and the current research was all around the science of reading. And so they were starting to hear about letters. And then the Minnesota Department of Education came out with the opportunity to train teachers, where they would pay for the training for the teachers. And I brought that to our superintendent's cabinet, and we incentivized a group of teachers, and we actually had 90 teachers sign up in that first year. Not only were they the K-3 teachers that the Department of Education offered, but then they expanded it. So we had multilingual learner teachers, special ed teachers, and intervention teachers, as well as teachers in grades 4, 5, and 6 who opted in to that early adoption. And their initial reaction was, I have never been trained this well in my life. This is transforming how I teach and what I know about teaching kids how to read. I think the other piece too is that there's a lot of emotional discovery that goes on when you start letters, because you have to be really reflective in how you've taught before. And balanced literacy and guided reading programs and the 3 cueing methods were what we had been trained how to do. And we were learning through the science of reading and through letters that we needed to redo what we had been doing. So with those 90 teachers who said, we have to do this, it gave us the knowledge base that we should bring this to the rest of the 140 teachers at the elementary level. And so we were able to do that. And to roll that out, we didn't have enough money to incentivize all the rest of the 140 teachers. But what we did do is we carved out an hour every week. So that means principals had to back off on a meeting, or they somehow carved out a morning, an afternoon, an additional prep time, whatever that was in each one of those buildings. And that were principals had the right to figure out how they were going to do that in their buildings. But they carved out an hour for teachers to either do their reading or their asynchronous study online. And then, since we were already meeting in collaborative teams, those collaborative teams then studied the bridges to practice, which are the application of learning, like how do I apply this to the students in my classroom? And so we felt like we had a really good basis for that teacher development. And that's the why is because it's based in that science of reading, which is that explicit, sequential, systematic instruction. And the response has just been overwhelmingly positive, even though it's a huge lift.
You know, you've all referred to this a little bit, which is the fact that this is a huge shift for teachers, and it's not something that happens overnight. So I'm curious, maybe Penny, starting with you, beyond the initial training that you did for districts, how did you then work with districts to ensure that districts and teachers had the support they needed for what's really a multi-year transition?
So there were a few things that we did. So from the policy side, and as the General Assembly was shaping the bill they ultimately passed, it was really making sure that it wasn't this short-sighted, here's the year to 18-month plan. This is what it's going to need to look like for 5, 10, 15 years in the future. And so that's something that I would just encourage folks to look at. Because a lot of times policy is about the right now and you forget the implications in out years. From a funding perspective, that was a really important point. Districts, I think, are able to focus a lot more clearly if they feel more settled that the money is going to be there to do the thing that is asked of them. Otherwise, it becomes how do I just get this off my plate? And so they want to have that level of commitment. So one thing is we did change our funding formula. I don't necessarily recommend that for everyone unless you are ready to do that. But it did make sure that we had additional money specifically for literacy in our elementary school grades, as well as incentivize literacy proficiency and growth, both in the accountability system, but certainly as an outcomes bonus for districts. So that was really important. The second thing was we used our federal ESSER funding and relief money on not one-time costs, but on investments that would have long-term payoff. And so those were things like creating networks and structures for districts to figure out how to do that within their own kind of regions. We used our core offices. We have regions across the state. And so we used that group led by Megan McElroy at the department. And she was able to then work with districts as teams to figure out what that support would look like from the department and to manage quality of their vendors. And then the third thing that I think was really important important was empowering other groups to then be able to support. You have folks like United Way and Boys and Girls Clubs and Save the Children and people who are really invested in literacy, and they're trying to figure out what their mark is going to be. If you can work with them closely, keep them updated on the resources and the expectations, that's a whole level of capacity that you actually can step away from and should step away from and empower locals to do that. But all of that only works if you had that funding, you had the implementation, but in that implementation bucket, again, with our core offices and with districts, you have a walkthrough tool, you're committed to using that tool and implementing it consistently across the board. You're then actually talking honestly about what those results are and targeting the areas of growth and development. And when districts know that it's not a penalty, they're not going to get dinged for it, there's no kind of shaming and blaming, it's actually only support. You get that when they're doing it on their own and it's not the state kind of coming in and bossing them around, but when you're doing that with them, they're able to have much more honest conversations with each other and with you. Underlying all of that is communications. And so again, if the state's just kind of creating the playground structure and the sandbox and districts are doing all of that work themselves, you have to have a strong comms plan. And I think a lot of states and districts fall down because it's like sending the flyer home with your kids in the folder. It just doesn't work because most people just don't read them. So we had teachers talking to teachers on video and saying, this is my experience of, know better, do better. We had teachers doing videos, helping other teachers figure out how to implement lessons and model those lessons. A ton of social media activity. Like I said, Riley the raccoon, we sent banners home if you met certain expectations. We had celebrations, Best for All Day, where we highlighted district work, but it was a massive positive campaign kind of push. And we included our General Assembly on every single press release and every single event. So it became politics and practice coming together, which can be just as important as ensuring the implementation folks are connected on the ground.
And Kiffany, I know in addition to requiring districts to provide professional development on the science of reading, that the state provides literacy coaches for public schools that receive a D or an F rating. Could you talk about the role of those literacy coaches and why you targeted your lowest performing schools for that work?
Yeah, sure. So, as you know, yes, that legislation that we just, it's our LEARNS legislation that we just passed, required that schools that have low performing students with reading, they do have to have a literacy coach. And primarily those literacy coaches are there to support classroom teachers with the implementation of the science of reading. As I said before, we know they have training, like we know who's trained. We know who needs to be trained if they're new, but we wanted to make sure that teachers are getting that 3-year support that they need in order to consistently implement the science of reading. And we know in some of our lowest performing schools that there's a high need for that. You have high numbers of students who are not reading at grade level, and we need them reading at grade level. And so they're there primarily to help the teacher, number one, with implementation. Our focus is on high quality instructional materials, making sure that they can use it skillfully, that they use it to the best of their ability around creating coherence with core instruction, with interventions, with high impact tutoring, that students aren't having to learn all these different processes. So really supporting the teacher with those important skills that are needed to use their HQIM well, but also to help administrators with recognizing what is proficiency when they're in classrooms. Our leaders are inundated with being both instructional leaders and managers. So they need that support with when I recognize that they're consistently over time implementing proficiently, how do I know that? So we've created look for documents. We've created experiences for our principals, our district leaders, where they're able to go through an assessor's training and they're able to say, okay, as I'm assessing, what is it that I'm looking for across the domains that are really important? So that is part of the work that they're doing as literacy coaches. Also making sure that we're expanding that support to families as needed, helping the teacher communicate those essential pieces to the families. Because we know with our families, they want to help, and they're really an important key lever to making sure our students are coming to school, reading at grade level, and doing those extra things that they need to do at home. So it's really about creating a even playing field around support year long. And so we've really stressed that it's not, just in the summer before school or after, but it's continuous support and their steady support to really make sure that they have robust literacy plans, robust implementation.
And we have a question from someone in the audience that I want to pose to all three with you, which is, how did you onboard teachers who came into their job after your implementation began?
For us, if they come in, we have a continuous phase 1 of training that all teachers can access. We have one that's provided from the state that is of no cost to districts, and we use our regional hubs to help us train. And we have over 200 trainers across our state who can provide that training. And again, it's through year. It's not a one-stop deal. Those trainers will also support those teachers in implementation in the classroom. So that's one way, or the district has the option to use one of our other pathways to make sure that they have continuous training for their teachers that are coming in new, whether that's, on an alternative route, or if they're coming from another state. Now we have when you come out of our EPPs, you're ready. You should be ready, but we used to have that as well when they started at a certain juncture in an EPP program. So
we'll turn to teacher preparation in a second, but you mentioned high quality instructional materials, and I didn't want to lose that really important thread, which is states have often been reluctant to address materials and the issue of curricula, but Arkansas and Tennessee both made high quality instructional materials a really core part of your strategy. And Kiffany, I'd love you to talk about why you did that. And then there was a question from the audience about how do you determine whether curriculum materials are high quality? And is it just evidence of efficacy as defined by ESSA, or are you looking at something else?
Yes. So, yes, thank you for that question, Lynn. But in Arkansas, we quickly recognized the importance of HQIM in the classroom. Number one, we know that when we have HQIM, we know that instruction is being delivered at grade level. And that was really key for us. We wanted to make sure that all of our students were getting grade level instruction. Now we know there needs to be some scaffold, some interventions, but really ensuring that all of our students are learning at grade level, we know is going to close the gap. And so that was really important. And one of the other things that we thought about is that our teachers needed support with teaching the science of reading. And so we wanted to make sure that they had good quality materials that would help them do that. And we focused in on the core. Our law does require that we have a list of high quality instructional materials for interventions as well, but we really focused in on the core. So we knew that if teachers had a great start, and that if our students are learning at grade level, that we have a better chance of getting all of our students reading at a faster pace than we had before. And so those embedded teacher supports in HQIM help them to be responsive in the moment. It helps them to plan more thoughtfully. And so we knew that if we did that, that everybody had a role that they could play, from our communities from our legislators to our state board. Everybody can participate in supporting HQIM. And so it just brings us closer together, creates this ecosystem of support around the work that we really know is important. And we know that's something that's going to last a long time, right? Like it's not going to be something that's going to get old, or we can use it for a long period of time and help sustain the work. And so we really were really consistent in messaging that. And so we thought it was really important, and it's proven to be important for us and to be a lever that we can lean on.
And Penny, I know Tennessee similarly has emphasized high quality instruction materials, and in addition developed free supplemental foundation skills curriculum. So would love you to talk about why you took that step, and again, how you see the role of instructional materials in shifting instruction in classrooms.
So I think when you look at the science of reading, one of the things that we know is that there's a really strong knowledge building component in that. You have to make sure that students understand the content, not just that they're able to read the words. We use the kind of this example a lot, where we've got a lot of folks who can read Spanish or French very fluently because they understand sounds and they're able to translate that, but they don't know what the words mean because they just don't have the vocabulary and language. And so you have to be able to understand what you're reading, not just the act of how to read the words. And so one of the things that we thought was really important was having a process to get a list. And now in law, districts must not just purchase, but adopt the materials on that list. That was a really hard shift because a lot of states have a purchase only requirement or it's a recommended list. And we said, no, if we know this is that important, then use what works. And part of that meant that you have to include teachers in that process. So our review committees were made up of Tennessee educators who were able to really understand the rubric and then judge and evaluate materials based on that rubric. And we had a couple starts and stops. We had a misaligned process at first. It wasn't where it needed to be. And we were committed and we redid the process to make sure that we had the materials that were best fit and best suited for students in Tennessee to meet those expectations. And that included just a number of things. Everything, again, is publicly available online, but it's standards alignment. It's making sure that you're aligned to the instructional shifts that are occurring in English language arts, specifically with the science of reading. It's looking at what implementation and instruction looks like and the supports for teachers in those materials. And then certainly a lot of our student groups and making sure that they would be supported with any kind of material. So that was the first part. I think that the second part around this work, and anytime that you're trying to do kind of a big adoption and the big compelling why, is that we know that outside of the teacher in the classroom, instructional materials have the single greatest ability to improve student achievement. And so if you have an excellent teacher in front of kids, give them the tools that they need to be able to maximize their talents and capacity with the kids that they have in front of them. And so we really felt like if you aren't giving teachers the tools, it's like putting a builder or a welder in front of a project without any kind of tools. It's the same thing. And so we really kind of emphasize the materials in that space for that reason. And then the last thing I'll say is, again, it's about transparency and making sure that people have access. Ed preps did not have access to the instructional materials because they weren't purchasers in the district. So we made that a requirement. If a local district is adopting curriculum A, B, or C, the ed preps need to have that so they can effectively support their teachers for the classrooms their teachers will likely end up with. We also did the same thing, and that was kind of the ed prep component. But with decodables or anything else, we saw that there were a lot of vendors and material providers who did a lot of the content, but did not do the phonics. And so that left out some really high quality providers who just, they were focusing on what they did best. And so we allowed for a waiver process to say, if you have materials that meet these parts of the rubric and you can combine them with someone else who meets this part of the rubric, and there's actually a couple of really important shifts that allowed for, then districts can submit a waiver, not the state, but the districts can ask for that waiver to say, we have high quality provider for content, high quality provider for phonics. They actually work really well together. Can we have the waiver to provide a comprehensive support system for our students? And that expanded not just into ELA, but certainly into our RTI and kind of tier 3 instruction and our tutoring work. It all had to be seamlessly aligned and stemming off of the high quality provider list.
And Mary, you mentioned that your whole process started with your curriculum adoption cycle. So again, curious about, you said you realized there was this body of research around the science of reading. How did you then go about finding a set of instructional materials that you thought met that quality bar?
Right. We started with casting the net wide and looking at all of the different curriculum that were out there and available. And then we used the Reading League's scorecard. And then we also used New York University's culturally responsive scorecard, because that also was important. We knew that there were curriculum out there that might teach our kids how to read, but also might do cultural harm within our classrooms. So those were both really important to us. So we cast the net wide. We looked at materials. We determined whether or not, first off, if it taught using the science of reading it. If it didn't, it came off of our list. And then we piloted several. And then throughout the year, we looked at the teacher feedback. What was our student response? We looked at just the instructional materials themselves. But then we looked at our early data and what were we seeing from student response. And from all of that conversation, then we made the decision to move into kind of a tier 1 core instruction that addresses both the decoding side of Scarborough's rope, but then also the comprehension side, right? And so I don't know if it's okay, I'll go ahead and talk about what we adopted, and that is we started with the phonemic awareness, and that is Haggerty. So we're teaching kids the oral sounds and getting them really used to hearing the sounds of words and the parts of speech, the parts of words. And then we moved into, we adopted Foundations, which is our core phonics instruction K-3. What I love about that is not only are we teaching the decoding and moving those tiles around to build words, the students are also then taking that and writing. They're learning how to write explicit sequential instruction in handwriting. It's incredible to see what our kids are doing with that, and then moving into learning about morphology and parts of words and how they go together. So that'll be an exciting thing to see our students grow with that. But complementing that, we adopted Wit and Wisdom as our comprehension program. And what we liked about Wit and Wisdom is, number one, they use real books.
Yeah.
Our kids have real books in their hands, right? And that's an exciting thing. It's not excerpts of books, but they're real books. And some of the quotes that I remember from our curriculum review conversation was, one teacher, fourth grade teacher, said, "My kids have never had to think this hard." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And she said, "Well, you know, with the other curriculum, we would read an excerpt. The kids would, you know, write a couple of sentences on what they thought about it, and then we moved on to the next excerpt the next day. But this requires us to read sometimes a portion of the book a second time. The kids then talk about it with their partners, they write about it, and they come back to their writing the next day to see, do they still agree with it? So it's teaching the critical thinking and collaboration skills that are really necessary for our kids to be successful. It's a knowledge.
Yeah, and I think, Mary, thank you. I mean, this point is important, that there's the science of reading is not just phonics. It's also all these other components. And one of the questions we had that I want to come back to from the audience is about the use of walkthroughs and other measures to help you understand whether instruction is really shifting in the classroom. Kiffany, you mentioned walkthroughs. Penny, I know you also use some classroom observation tools in Tennessee. Could you talk about the role of those and the kind of interim measures you use to really know if instruction is shifting?
You want to go, Penny?
I was going to say, go ahead, Kiffany. I'm happy to, but feel free.
Yeah, so you know, we used our look for tools primarily to describe, like, what are you looking for, number one, in the environment, right? Because as we know, shifted from balanced literacy, a lot of that environment piece was critical, right? And so we use it for that purpose too, but also just getting into the details around the different components. We use them to really describe the things that you see that should consistently be present when you're in a classroom. So whenever you walk in, you should see most of these look fors happening. There are some things that are nuanced depending on where you are in your lesson line, but for the most part, what should you expect to see daily? There are some things that will happen sometimes, and also like we should never see some things that are not healthy for students when we're teaching them to read. And I think it was just a piece to have some consistency also across conversations that we were having about the science of reading. And it was something that we threaded through trainings, through our walkthroughs, any debriefing we would have. If we kept the conversation focused, we know that we're staying in line with the science of reading. So I think it was a tool that gave us a lot of consistency in our conversations and discussions and expectations around the science of reading. So at a just high level, we have it there, and we use it and we revise it over time as needed as we see a shift in the research. So it's an anchor for us across our state.
Yeah, and I think similarly for us, and I don't actually think I have too much to add there. There was kind of some connection to the pre-K space, so I included a link to what we did in the pre-K space, but I think Kiffany nailed it. So we do something very similar in Tennessee. The one caution I would give, though, is just around the actual length of the rubric that we use. I have been on the other side where the rubric is 5, 10, 15 pages long. There's content in every box to be super prescriptive. Nobody uses that because nobody has time for it. And so one of the things that we really pushed was it had to be one piece of paper. You can't even flip it over because it's not an evaluation metric. It's just about narrowing the scope of where you need to focus to support an educator. So it actually, for us, and I put the link in the chat, but it was just kind of a yes, somewhat, or no. And then what you can see is, okay, here are the areas where it's going pretty well. Here are areas you need to target, and you can prioritize from there. And then you can actually do a much more targeted observation for folks about the things or the areas where folks need the most support. We trained that similarly to what Kiffany said, across the board, looked for alignment. The state helped to support. Districts really own that tool. And again, district to district, they did peer walkthroughs in classrooms so that as cohorts, they could figure out where to focus.
And, all of you've mentioned several times sort of the role of educator preparation programs. And that's often sort of the last thing to be addressed, somewhat slower to change. I'd love, Kiffany and Penny, for you to talk about the combination of incentives and requirements that you use to get teacher preparation programs engaged and how that's been going. Kiffany, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm gonna try to do this justice for Carly, but I think one of the essential pieces that we did fairly well was that we made sure that the conversation was happening with both the EPPs and K-12, and I think that was really critical. Like everybody on the same page, being focused on the transition, but and I think that's one of the things that help EPPs to come along, is not to be left behind, right? To be in the initial conversation. And I think Carly's team, working with my team, we've tried to do a really good job of that, keeping everybody in the system together, working on this. But I would say also some of the other things that we're doing to keep them motivated and with us is, I know calling them started with competencies, right? Like making sure that you had the competencies that were going to yield what you needed to teach our aspiring teachers and to help them to be day one ready when they came out of those programs. We've also joined to use some of our ESSER dollars to establish communities of practice around this work that joins K-12 and EPPs in the work together. And so that has been a big lever. One of the other things that we did was granted funds to our EPPs to establish labs around high quality instructional materials. And those labs will afford them the opportunity to have those materials that are being purchased in their regions, and to have some collaboration with our regional hubs, our schools, and make it more authentic than it was before. So those are some of the opportunities that I can think of top of mind that we've done together with our EPPs, and just continuous communication and opportunities for us to train together and to open the communication, the two-way communication between us, so that we can have a seamless system around our aspiring teachers being ready to go into schools to teach the science of reading.
And we had a similar, I think in Tennessee, again, it's kind of that three-prong, but the policy put into place the requirement for ed preps. And so there's a little bit of the carrot and the stick there, and want to be just really transparent about that. Intrinsic motivation is wonderful, and sometimes the requirement helps too. And so we had that piece on the policy. From a funding perspective, we used our federal grants. Again, it was one-time money, but we were able to invest in a way that will have long-term effects. And so we're able to provide grants to a handful of ed preps. So again, they could develop their own content that we then looked at and made sure was going to match what we required of the state. So they got that initial grant funding, which was really helpful. And then from an implementation perspective, worked closely with them in terms of the ongoing teacher training that would happen as part of their course and content, the training that they did for teachers to support kind of the onboarding of those, what will be in the end over 50,000 teachers in a 2.5-year period, as well as the tutors for our Tennessee All-Core program. And then I think third was moving towards an evaluative model. And so one of the things that is just, it's really hard, but we in pre-K 12 know it very, very well, is trust but verify. And so we don't necessarily engage in that same practice with our ed preps. And many of our states, we actually oversee some of that ed prep work between the department and the state board. And so just because the law was passed and just because the content aligns, it does not mean that implementation is happening at the quality or alignment that you would expect. Just like we say all the time about classrooms, and we had that conversation earlier. And so having the department go in to be able to see whether or not the content being taught to teachers actually is aligned with what we reviewed is a really important component. It is very sticky. It is very uncomfortable. It is very unpopular, but ultimately those are all adult issues and adult conflict. Kids deserve to have the best quality instruction in front of them. That can only happen if we all do our part to hold ourselves accountable, to be aligned to what works for kids, make sure our future teachers are being instructed appropriately and at the level and with the content that we know is aligned to the science, and then be able to make sure we can hold them to expectations. But if they don't get that on the front end, it's really unfair to hold them accountable on the back end. And you have to do the hard work with ed preps to make sure that our future teachers are getting what they need. So that's the third part. I'm not going to say it was well received, but we continued to work through it. And I think good collaboration, good partnerships, and frankly, resources help to make sure that that pathway is cleared. And I will give credit, lots of good leadership at the University of Tennessee in particular on this. They've been exceptional partners holding and creating centers like our Reading Research Center in Tennessee to be able to kind of create that cool kids club that everybody likes to join no matter what field you're in. That you want to be part of the pace setters that are doing the really exciting work. And we had some universities, MTSU is another one that was just, they were exceptional partners.
Yeah, and I know it's a great point because I know other states like Colorado have also done sort of these deep dive audits into the actual curricula and experiences of students in methods courses and in their student teaching experiences to really make sure this is happening in practice. And that does take a certain amount of state courage to dive in that way. I want to shift a little now and ask about the screening and interventions for students, because even if you get core instruction right, there are still going to be some students who are going to have reading difficulties. And I'd love all three of you to talk about how at this point are you identifying those students, and how do you think about the interventions provided to them to get them up to grade level? Mary, you're on.
Yeah, Mary, go ahead.
Yep, I will talk from the practitioner's experience here. But MDE, again, also gave us a sense of what screeners that we can use. And our district has been using FastBridge early reading program, and then we use CBMs to progress monitor our students. But I think the additional thing that we have this year with adopting Foundations and with adopting Wit and Wisdom is that Foundations has an end of unit assessment that's going to give us a lot of information about our kids mastering those skills that we're providing. So we have direct feedback that's also going to inform our assessments about whether students might be having those reading difficulties. But also going through letters training, we have the PAST assessment and the phonics and word screening survey. So we are looking at those and as a combination of tools to be able to identify what strengths and also then what areas of weakness our kids might have and how do we support them. And then also providing those interventions. And I think, I don't know if it was Kiffany or Penny talking about that our tier 2 has to align with our tier 1. So the tier 2 interventions can't be totally separate from what we're doing in the classroom. So that's what we're trying to understand. And MDE hasn't decided yet exactly what our tier 2 interventions are going to be and what that list is going to be. But I think as long as it's aligned, of course, with our tier 1, and that's the direction we're looking, is making sure that the interventions are aligned with what's happening in the classroom. So our kids are having an aligned experience from classroom to classroom.
That's a really key point. And Penny, you did talk about at the beginning the importance of cohesion and alignment in general. And would love you to talk about that in terms of the Tennessee Tutoring Initiative and how you ensured that the tutoring that was happening was actually aligned to the science of reading and the instruction that was happening during core instruction.
Absolutely. And I think to build a little bit on Mary's point, the screener, having a universal screener across the board and then getting tighter and tighter on the use of that screener and the data and tying that to the eventual kind of third grade and second grade state assessments we got was really, really important. The only thing we haven't said, I want to make sure I say it, is characteristics of dyslexia has been a massive component in everything that we did. We knew that there were such a high number of students who were not having that need addressed. And so in any of this work, sometimes that becomes this other thing that happens on the side. That was actually massively included in every single component and how we thought about the screener to the materials to the training. And so from that cohesion perspective, as the kind of 15-second summary, the state funded and funds forevermore permanent summer school for rising kinders, so those pre-K to kinder all the way through rising ninth grade. Free summer school, free to the parents, cost to the state, summer programming forevermore as a legacy project from our ESSER funds, as well as Tennessee All-Core, which is a tutoring program, started out as 150,000 students in the elementary and early middle school grades, and now is expanded, and there's a kind of universal high school option. What we found is we read thousands of pages of research, really helpful. Annenberg Foundation was really helpful for that, and Brown University. But what we found was that we held the line on the ratio 3-to-1 in elementary school. We held the line on having it be 2 to 3 days per week, the same tutor. Outside of that, we allowed for that first year to be a little bit more flexible. What we found after the first year is it had to happen during the school day for attendance. And number two is it had to be aligned to the instructional materials during the school day, period, full stop. Having students learn in one way with content and then shift to something else, you know, intuitively wasn't going to work as well, but you want to allow folks to be able to test and see to what extent. And so now what we've done is we actually went back, saw the materials that were being adopted in districts for our 3 most popular materials that were adopted, and actually took that, did extended units into the summer. So students who needed more time to get to just right or grade level instruction had that same content in the summer. In the same way for our during school tutoring, we were able to build that into our RTI block for tier 3 in particular. And so tutors were trained in the science of reading. They had the same training as our traditional teachers. Our ed preps provided that training. And actually, University of Tennessee, is another shout out, requires their teacher candidates to participate in Tennessee All-Core as part of just more and more at-bats for instruction and to give them coaching. And then the third thing was, again, not doing remediation. As a state, we have fundamentally pushed back on the idea of remediation and only talk about acceleration. It's about getting our students to grade level instruction, and that's just in time learning. So the day before, knowing what the lesson would be the next day, being able to do a lot of the pre-teaching, a lot of the connector and bridge activities to get the student to grade level for content, and then being able to use that tier 3 instruction for some of the other components, such as phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, some vocab, et cetera. We extended that not just to the tutoring that was happening in the pre-K through third grade space, but again, all the way up into high school, because what we found was that in middle school and high school, educators who were trying to do remediation with their students were missing the fact that their high school students still did not have basic phonemic awareness and phonics. And so you actually had to go back and teach in the same way that you might teach a K through 3. And you can see massive jumps in achievement because students, they figured out the code. They weren't trying to figure out the word, but actually the code to be able to sound out the word and then read the word fluently. All of that was part of our Tennessee All-Core program, and it got stronger. Again, we're in year 3 of that, but you see that build. It has to be allow yourself to fail a little bit, and you're failing up into something that's a lot more impactful for kids. And so we're excited about how many kids have that.
I know one of the most controversial parts is third grade retention for students who are still not reading on grade level at the end of third grade. And Kiffany, Penny, both your states have that. What's been the reaction to that? And what would your advice be to other states as they think about this issue?
I'll just say that, you know, we just recently have legislation that passed around third grade retention. So we have a little bit of a runway to develop a strategy around it. But I think, you know, just initially, all of us are wanting to make sure that we can think about prevention, right, and intervention, and how do we build communication around that. so that we don't have large mass numbers of students that are being retained in third grade. So what we're doing right now is learning lots of lessons from states like Tennessee, Mississippi. I mean, honestly, we just got our legislation 3 or 4 months ago, but I think really we are wanting to really make sure that we have a strong strategy that supports teachers, families, but we're learning good lessons. So I'm going to pass to Penny to kind of give us some advice here.
Yep, I bottom line is hunker down, but I think if I'm just being really direct, but one of the things I think that we did well, and then something we didn't do well on the front end, if it's kind of a 3-act play, the beginning is it was in the policy, it gave 2 years notice, and that was something that was not in the original legislation. Our General Assembly felt really strongly about it. And certainly, as did our governor, was added in, but it gave 2 years for prep. So I think giving that advance notice was a good thing. What we didn't do as well is provide ongoing regular conversation. Is just a reminder, it's coming. We waited until kind of the 6 months before. And part of that was it was during COVID and we were overwhelmed. And part of it was we have other things we need to tackle besides this thing. I would not recommend that. I would recommend just making sure you're speaking as frequently as possible to something that creates a lot of fear and stress in folks, even if it doesn't play out that way. Once we got to the actual retention conversation, which is that middle part, it was making sure that you had clarity in the forms, the appeals, the processes, all of those things so that districts understood which students qualified and which students didn't. Districts had some way to manage and budget for how many students might have one of the out clauses, which is if you're not proficient, you can do summer school or have tutoring and or show proficiency on one of these other very kind of clear measures. That having a process that helped districts work through that and provide a package of materials that they can then adapt and give to families is really helpful, because 147 districts recreating the same stuff is just not efficient or productive. And so having that well in advance, which again, we could have done better at as a state, but having that well in advance to be able to say, these are the pathways, here's your list of kids who can have an out this way, or that way. Here are the students that are just going to be retained. Like that's what you're looking at. All of those things I think are really helpful. And then on the back end, being really transparent with the data. These are the students that were able to these are the students that were retained. These are the students that opted out or had a waiver. These are the students who did summer school. And these are the students who were going to do tutoring, and making sure parents were very, very well informed. Because in that third part, we had, I think, too many families who at the back end did not understand, regardless of what the requirements were, regardless of everything that went home, they thought their students were doing better than their students actually were performing. And so their grade was fine on the report card, but the proficiency was low on the screener and every other assessment. And that's a very hard circle to square for districts and teachers, especially teachers are having those conversations. So digging into the hard part about grade and proficiency alignment is a big conversation, but it was a big, big miss, I think. And we see that in a lot of states. And then just being very real with parents that it's extra support for your child so that they can be on grade level and achieve everything that they have the possibility to do if they are reading on grade level. When we framed it as an opportunity and not as a consequence, we actually had parents who rescinded their waiver because they said, wait, you're telling me I could get free tutoring next year for my child? Like, that's great. That's no skin off my back. It happens during the school day. They wanted to have the support. They just didn't want their child to be retained from a social perspective. So I think it's making sure, again, communication is going to be the thread the whole way through, and doing so proactively and not being scared to take the hits, because you're going to take the hits on third grade retention. There's really no way out of that.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that. And in the last few minutes, I'd love all of you, as you think back to your implementation journey to date, and I know it's not done. Are there things that you would do differently now, looking back, and advice that you would give to other states or districts that are just starting down this path? And Kiffany, Mary, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I would say what really matters is communication. And I think we've said this so many times, but I don't think we can overstate it. Communication matters, and you have to have a robust communication plan, and you have to really understand what communication needs to go to what part of your ecosystem of support. One thing that we've really done is we actually have a map of our ecosystem of support, and we've listed out how do they help us with this? And what should we be communicating? What messages are they carrying? And one of the things that we've done is we've had, pre-made slide decks where people don't have to think of what to say, right? Like, here's the message, if you will, carry for us that's really going to be important for families, for regions, for superintendents, for teachers, like really making sure that everybody understands the why and the how and what support is coming. So I cannot overstate communication matters, because it's going to get people to participate or not, and to do it for the long haul. So,
Mary, advice for other districts as they start down this road?
Well, and I think also just advice for state agencies is not only do we need the curriculum, but we will need either some incentivizing money or professional development money, because we brought in 2 major curriculum with foundations and with Wit and Wisdom, and then our DLI program with Amplifies Caminos. We needed more opportunities to train our teachers at the front end of the year, and we just didn't have enough time. So I think, is there a way to provide that? And then I think as we're rolling this out in the future, a question that I really try to do is to align our systems. So what's our teacher evaluation system? Or we use our alternative teacher professional pay system that has peer coaches talking with our teachers. Those folks are a part of our building implementation teams. And so how could they be trained by the state agencies that are also then going to be training across the state of Minnesota? I think that's a really important cohort, especially for districts who have a lot of teachers who've already gone through some of those required trainings. So I think I'd like to see that our systems align, so that evaluation system aligns with our literacy implementation system, that aligns with what our expectations of kids are. That's what I'd like to see and suggest to other districts and other states that really have that hat on, so that we are the best thing for our kids.
That's a super important point, and it gets back to this issue of cohesion alignment, which is that I think too often we send very mixed messages to the people on the ground about what they should really be paying attention to and how to prioritize. And if you don't have those systems aligned, it's very hard then to do really good implementation that's going to lead to consistent change in classrooms. And I think that gets to Kiffany's point too, about looking at all of the stakeholders in your environment and thinking about how does every role in the system touch on early literacy instruction, and how do you need to make those adjustments so everybody is really moving in the same direction. Last question, because I don't want to miss this. Penny, you talked about both using ESSER funds and then about sustainability of funding. Mary, you just talked about this in terms of funding. Kiffany, could you also address the sustainability of this work and how you thought about money to sustain this transition over time, so that it's not just a one-time, one-shot, one-year deal?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, and I'm glad you brought this up, Mary, one of the things we did was we made sure that we had opportunities to incentivize around the purchasing of HQIM, as well as high quality professional learning for the HQIM. So we've done that all throughout. We've seen a significant growth in HQIM in both literacy and mathematics, to be honest. So we've done that, and we still have that. That's ongoing. And any opportunity we have to incentivize around it, we do. Because it matters, and we don't want that to be a barrier. But we've also tied some of this to how do you use your funds well that you get, that may be whether it's title funds, or even when ESSER dollars came along, we advised on that, and we've combined our public school accountability work with our work to ensure that we're not sending a different message, and that we're maximizing funds that go to districts as well as funds that we have. So we've done that as well. So that's helping us to sustain that work. And so any opportunity we get, we live in that space of incentivizing. There are other things, but that's what comes to top of mind, because that's what matters for most people, is that if they can't get it, how can I implement? So I'll leave it at that, but it's a big piece.
Well, I know we're at time. Thank you so much for your insights, the hard work you've done in your states and districts on this issue, and definitely more to be continued as we look at this sort of multi-year change process around the country, but really helpful to think about how you move from law to action. So thank you all so much.
You,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks.